I woke with a start, my heart pounding in my chest, the unfamiliar softness beneath me jarring against the ache in my bones. The room was a vision of opulence. Soft morning light streamed through a massive window, casting golden rays across. A bed draped in white silk, the intricate carvings on the headboard gleaming like something out of a dream. Beige silk curtains swayed gently in the early breeze, their delicate rustle the only sound in the stillness. I blinked, disoriented, my fingers brushing against the fabric of the oversized black t-shirt I was wearing. A faint, masculine scent clung to it, sandalwood and something sharper like cedar, making my pulse quicken. Where was I? The memory hit me like a wave. Last night, after a grueling shift at the Caldwell Plaza, I'd collapsed in an empty room, too exhausted to make it to the staff quarters. My hands still ached from scrubbing floors, my knees bruised from hours on the cold marble. I was Charlotte Bennett, a maid, a nobody in this glittering world of the elite. So why was I here, in a suite that screamed wealth, wearing a shirt that clearly didn't belong to me? The door swung open with a sharp creak, and a man stepped inside, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a tailored black suit that seemed to absorb the light. His eyes, gray, piercing, and cold as ice, locked onto me, and I felt the air leave my lungs. "You're wearing my shirt," he said, his voice low and commanding, each word a blade slicing through the silence. "Do you know who I am?" I shook my head, my throat dry, my body frozen as I tried to sit up. My legs felt like lead, trembling beneath me. I wanted to speak, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. He took a step closer, his gaze never wavering, and I saw the sharp lines of his face, high cheekbones, a jaw that could cut glass, and a faint scar above his left eyebrow that only added to his intensity. "I am Nathan Caldwell," he said, his tone as unyielding as steel. "CEO of the Caldwell Corporation. And you, apparently, have been sleeping in my bed." Nathan Caldwell. The name sent a shiver down my spine. I'd seen him in the tabloids, on the covers of business magazines, his face a mask of power and control. He owned this hotel, this empire, and I was nothing more than a speck in his world, a maid who'd made a terrible mistake. I'm sorry," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean to. I was so tired, He raised a hand, cutting me off, his expression unreadable. "I don't need your excuses," he said, his voice as cold as the marble, floors I'd scrubbed for years. "But I do have a proposition." He paused, his eyes narrowing as they studied me, and I felt exposed, as if he could see every crack in my carefully guarded walls. "You will stay here for 30 days, he continued, as my companion. "If you refuse, you'll lose your job." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My job, my lifeline, the only thing keeping me afloat, was on the line. I wanted to scream, to tell him he had no right, but the weight of his gaze pinned me in place. I thought of Emily, my little sister, her bright smile as she told me about her dreams of becoming a doctor. She was in college now, her tuition paid for by every aching hour I spent on my knees, cleaning rooms for people like Nathan Caldwell. I couldn't lose this job. I couldn't let her down. "I don't have a choice, do I?" I said, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. I forced myself to meet his gaze, searching for a flicker of humanity in those storm-gray eyes. But there was nothing, just a void. A man who'd built walls higher than the skyscrapers his family owned. "No," he replied simply, his tone final, as if the matter was already decided. "You don't." He turned to leave, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. But then he paused, glancing back at me over his shoulder. "You'll be moved to a private suite. Be ready by noon." with that, he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft thud that echoed in the silence. I sat there, my hands shaking, the t-shirt suddenly feeling like a shackle around my body. What had I just agreed to? 30 days as his companion. What did that even mean? My mind raced, 1,000 questions swirling. But one thought anchored me: Emily. I reached into the pocket of my uniform, still crumpled on the floor, and pulled out the one thing that always grounded me: a faded handkerchief, its edges frayed from years of use. It had belonged to my father, a man who'd worked himself to the bone to provide for us until cancer took him 5 years ago. I ran my fingers over the soft fabric, tracing the embroidered initials, JB, and whispered the promise I'd made at his grave. "I'll take care of Emily, Dad. I won't let you down." Tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them away, forcing myself to stand. I couldn't afford to break. Not now. Nathan Caldwell might think he owned me for the next 30 days, but he didn't know me. He didn't know the fire that burned inside me, the determination that had kept me going through every hardship. I would survive this. For Emily, for my father's memory, for myself. But as I looked around the room, the silk sheets, the gilded mirror, the world of wealth I'd never belonged to, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into a cage, one I might never escape. The days that followed felt like a slow descent into a gilded prison. I was moved to a private suite within the Caldwell Plaza, a space so luxurious it seemed to mock my existence. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline, lights twinkling like stars against the night sky. But all I could feel was the weight of the invisible bars around me. The suite was a masterpiece of elegance: marble countertops, a plush velvet sofa, a chandelier that cast prisms of light across the walls. But it wasn't a home. It was a cage. And I was a bird with clipped wings, trapped in Nathan Caldwell's world. Every morning I was expected to accompany him, though the term remained as vague as the man himself. Some days, it meant sitting silently in his office while he worked, his fingers flying across a laptop keyboard, his brow furrowed in concentration. Other days, it meant trailing behind him as he met with investors, my presence a silent prop in his carefully curated image. He rarely spoke to me, his words clipped and formal when he did, but his eyes, those storm-gray eyes, watched me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. They were unreadable, a tempest of emotions I couldn't decipher, and yet they held me captive, as if he were searching for something in me I didn't even know I possessed. I tried to keep my distance, to build a wall between us, but Nathan's presence was a force I couldn't ignore. He was a man of contradictions, cold and commanding one moment, distant and haunted the next. I told myself I didn't care, that I was here for Emily, for the job that kept her dreams alive. But a part of me couldn't help but wonder, who was Nathan Caldwell, really? What lay beneath the polished exterior of the man who held my fate in his hands? The answer came on the 5th night, in a moment that shattered the fragile silence between us. I was in his office, a cavernous room lined with oak bookshelves that stretched to the ceiling, the air heavy with the scent of leather and old paper. A single desk lamp cast a warm glow across the space, illuminating the stacks of documents I'd been tasked with organizing. My hands moved mechanically, sorting papers into neat piles, but my mind was elsewhere, back in the small apartment I'd shared with my father and Emily, where the evenings were filled with laughter and the clinking of knitting needles as Dad taught us how to make scarves by the fireplace. The memory brought a lump to my throat, and I blinked back tears, focusing on the task at hand. That's when it happened. As I reached for a folder, my elbow brushed against a small stack of papers, sending them tumbling to the floor. Among them was an envelope, yellowed with age, its edges frayed as if it had been handled 1,000 times. I bent to pick it up, and a letter slipped out, the handwriting delicate and trembling. I couldn't help but read the first line. You chose your father's honor over our love. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, the words searing into my mind like a brand. The door opened behind me, and I turned to see Nathan standing there, his silhouette framed by the hallway light. His eyes landed on the letter in my hand, and for a moment, I saw something raw flash across his face. Pain, sharp and unguarded, like a wound torn open. "Don't touch what doesn't belong to you," he said, his voice a low growl, colder than I'd ever heard it. He crossed the room in 3 strides, snatching the letter from my hand, but not before I saw the signature at the bottom. Mom. I should have stayed silent, should have let him retreat behind his walls, but the words slipped out before I could stop them. "Why did you abandon her?" I asked, my voice trembling, a mix of curiosity and accusation. "Your mother." What? Did she mean, you chose your father's honor? Nathan froze, his back to me, his hand still clutching the letter. For a long moment, he didn't move, didn't speak, and I thought he might ignore me altogether. But then he turned, and the look in his eyes stopped me cold. They were no longer the unreadable storm I'd come to expect. They were a maelstrom of grief, of regret, of a pain so deep it seemed to carve him hollow. "Because I had no choice," he whispered, his voice hoarse, each word a jagged shard of glass. "My father demanded loyalty, and I gave it to him. I gave up everything, my mother, my happiness, my chance at love, to be the son he wanted." I stood there, stunned, the weight of his confession pressing down on me like a physical force. Nathan Caldwell, the untouchable CEO, the man who seemed to hold the world in his iron grip, was broken. I saw it in the way his shoulders slumped, in the way his fingers tightened around the letter, as if it were the only thing tethering him to the past. For the first time, I saw him not as my captor, but as a man haunted by the choices he'd made. A man who'd sacrificed everything for a legacy he didn't even want. He turned away, his movements stiff, and I knew the moment of vulnerability was over. "Leave," he said, his voice flat, the walls slamming back into place. I wanted to say something, to reach out, but the words wouldn't come. So I did as he asked, stepping out into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind me with a finality that echoed in my chest. As I walked back to my suite, my mind replayed his words, his pain, and I felt a flicker of something I hadn't expected: empathy. I thought of my own father, of the sacrifices he'd made for me and Emily, working double shifts at the factory until his body gave out. He'd given everything to protect us, to give us a chance at a better life, and I'd promised to do the same for Emily. But Nathan, he'd given up his family, his love, for a different kind of duty, one that had left him hollow. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring out at the city lights, and I wondered, could a man like Nathan Caldwell ever find redemption, and why did I care? By the 10th day, the silence between Nathan and me had become a living thing, a heavy, suffocating presence that pressed down on me with every step I took in his world. I'd learned to navigate the gilded cage of the Caldwell Plaza, to move through its marble halls and glittering ballrooms with a quiet resignation, but the weight of Nathan's unspoken expectations was a burden I couldn't shake. I was his companion, a role I still didn't fully understand, and yet I felt like a marionette, my strings pulled by a man who seemed to see me as nothing more than a means to an end. That night, the hotel hosted a gala, a spectacle of wealth and power that turned the grand ballroom into a sea of shimmering gowns and tailored tuxedos. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the room, their light reflecting off the polished silverware and the delicate flutes of champagne that waiters carried on trays. I stood at Nathan's side, dressed in a deep, teal silk gown he'd chosen for me, the fabric clinging to my skin like a second layer of armor. It was beautiful, more elegant than anything I'd ever worn. But it felt like a costume, a disguise for the maid I truly was. I forced a smile as Nathan introduced me to his business associates, their names and faces blurring together in a haze of polite nods and empty pleasantries. "This is Charlotte," he'd say, his voice smooth and controlled, his hand resting lightly on the small of my back. I played my part, nodding and smiling, but inside, I was screaming. The weight of it all, the gown, the charade, the silence, became too much. I couldn't breathe in that room, couldn't stand the way Nathan's touch felt both possessive and detached, as if I were a prop in his carefully curated life. I needed air, needed to escape, even if just for a moment. "Excuse me," I murmured, pulling away from him mid-conversation with a silver-haired investor. Nathan's eyes flicked to me, a question in their storm-gray depths, but I didn't wait for his response. I slipped through the crowd, my heels clicking against the polished floor, and pushed through a set of glass doors onto the balcony. The night air hit me like a balm, cool and sharp, carrying the faint scent of rain. I gripped the iron railing, my knuckles whitening as I stared out at the city below, its lights a constellation of dreams I'd never dared to chase. The moon hung low in the sky, its silvery light casting a soft glow over the balcony, and for a moment, I let myself breathe, let the tension in my chest unravel. But the reprieve was short-lived. The glass doors opened behind me, and I felt Nathan's presence before I heard his footsteps, his polished shoes tapping against the stone tiles. "Why did you leave?" he asked, his voice low, a thread of irritation woven through it. I didn't turn to face him, my hand still gripping the railing as if it were the only thing keeping me grounded. "I needed air," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of exhaustion and defiance. "I can't keep doing this, Nathan. I'm not your puppet." The words spilled out before I could stop them, raw and unfiltered, and I turned to face him, my eyes blazing. The moonlight illuminated his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw, the faint scar above his eyebrow, and those gray eyes that seemed to hold a storm within them. His expression didn't change, but I saw the muscle in his jaw tighten, a flicker of something, anger perhaps, or something deeper, crossing his face. "You think I want you here because I enjoy this?" he said, his voice sharp, each word a blade slicing through the night air. "I need you, Charlotte. I need you to keep up appearances, to show my father I'm in control. You're here because I can't afford to look weak." His words hit me like a slap, the cold truth of my role in his life laid bare. I was a tool, a shield to protect his image. Nothing more. The realization stung, a bitter ache that settled deep in my chest. But it also ignited something inside me, a spark of rebellion, a refusal to be reduced to a pawn in his game. "I'm not a prop, Nathan," I said, my voice steady now, though my hands trembled at my sides. "I'm a person, with a life, with people who depend on me. I'm not here for your father's approval." For a moment, he said nothing. His gaze locked on mine, the storm in his eyes swirling with an intensity that made my breath catch. Then, without warning, he stepped closer, his hand reaching out to grasp mine. His touch was firm, but not harsh, his thumb brushing lightly over the back of my hand, sending a jolt of warmth through me that I couldn't ignore. "I'm not good at this," he said, his voice softer now, rough around the edges, as if the words were being torn from him. "I'm not good at showing what I feel. But I need you, Charlotte. More than you know, I wanted to pull away, to retreat behind the walls I'd built to protect myself, but I couldn't. His touch, his words, the raw vulnerability in his voice, they held me in place, a tether I hadn't expected. I looked into his eyes, searching for the man I'd glimpsed in his office, the one who'd carried the weight of his mother's letter like a cross. And for the first time, I saw something beyond the cold exterior. A flicker of need, of longing, of a man who'd built his life on control but was starting to crack under its weight. The wind picked up, a gust that sent a shiver down my spine, and I realized how close we were standing. The heat of his body a stark contrast to the cool night air. My heart pounded. A chaotic rhythm I couldn't control, and I knew something had shifted between us, something I wasn't ready to name. I cared about him. Despite everything, despite the silence, despite the cage he'd put me in. And that realization terrified me more than anything else. The 15th day arrived like a storm on the horizon, dark and inevitable, its shadow creeping into every corner of the Caldwell Plaza. I'd spent the past few days replaying Nathan's words on the balcony, the raw vulnerability in his voice haunting me like a melody I couldn't shake. I need you, Charlotte, more than you know. Those words had cracked something open inside me, a fissure I couldn't close, and I found myself watching him more closely, searching for glimpses of the man beneath the mask. But Nathan had retreated behind his walls again, his silence a fortress I couldn't breach, and I was left with a tangle of emotions I didn't know how to unravel. That afternoon, the storm broke. I was in the hotel's grand lobby, arranging a stack of guest folios at the concierge desk, a task Nathan had assigned to keep me busy, when the air shifted, a chill running through the space like a warning. I looked up, and there he was, an older man, tall and imposing, striding through the entrance with the confidence of someone who owned the world. His silver hair was swept back, his tailored suit a deep charcoal gray, and the ebony cane in his hand tapped a steady rhythm against the marble floor, each strike echoing like a gavel. His eyes, a colder shade of gray than Nathan's, scanned the room with predatory precision, and when they landed on me, I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. He approached the desk, his presence a weight that pressed against my chest, and I straightened, forcing a polite smile. "Good afternoon, sir," I said, my voice steady despite the unease coiling in my stomach. "How can I assist you?" "I'm here for my son," he said, his voice deep and commanding, each word laced with an authority that brooked no argument. "I am Edward Caldwell." The name hit me like a blow, and I froze, my mind racing. Edward Caldwell, Nathan's father, the man who'd shaped him into the cold, controlled CEO I'd come to know, the man who'd demanded Nathan sacrifice everything for the family's honor. I'd seen the pain in Nathan's eyes when he spoke, of his father, the regret that had carved lines into his face, and now, standing before me, was the source of that pain. Before I could respond, Nathan appeared, his footsteps quick and purposeful as he crossed the lobby. "Father," he said, his voice tight, a controlled edge to it that didn't match the tension in his posture. He stopped beside me, his hand brushing against my arm, a fleeting touch, but enough to send a jolt through me. "What are you doing? Here?" Edward's gaze shifted to Nathan, and the air between them crackled with unspoken history. "I came to see the mess you've made," Edward said, his tone icy, his thin lips curling into a sneer. "Parading this girl around as if she belongs in our world. You've disgraced the Caldwell name, Nathan. I taught you better than this." The words were a lash, sharp and cutting, and I saw Nathan flinch, a subtle movement that betrayed the impact of his father's disdain. His face paled, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, the knuckles whitening with the force of his grip. I waited for him to respond, to defend himself, to defend me. But he said nothing. His silence, a deafening admission of defeat. The lobby seemed to shrink around us, the murmurs of guests and staff fading into a distant hum, and I felt a surge of anger on Nathan's behalf, a protective instinct I hadn't expected. That night, I found him in his office, the same space where I'd discovered his mother's letter days before. The room was dimly lit, the desk lamp casting a soft glow over the oak bookshelves. the shadows dancing across the walls like ghosts. Nathan sat behind his desk, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. His tie loosened, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He looked exhausted, the sharp lines of his face softened by fatigue. And for the first time, I saw the toll his father's words had taken on him. "Why didn't you fight back?" I asked, my voice trembling as I stood in the doorway, my hands clasped tightly in front of me to keep them from shaking. "Why did you let him talk to you like that?" Nathan looked up, his gray eyes meeting mine, and I saw the storm within. Them, pain, anger, and a deep, aching regret that seemed to consume him. "Because he's right," he said, his voice hoarse, each word a confession torn from the depths of his soul. "I've spent my life trying to be the son he wanted, the heir he demanded. I gave up everything, my mother, my chance at love, my own happiness, to protect the Caldwell name. And for what? To be reminded that I'll never be enough?" His words hit me like a wave, the rawness of his pain washing over me, and I felt my own heart ache in response. I stepped closer, drawn to him despite myself, and placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the tension in his muscles beneath the fabric of his shirt. "You don't have to live in his shadow, Nathan," I said softly, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. "You're more than his expectations. You're more than the Caldwell name." He didn't respond, but I felt his body relax slightly under my touch, a silent acknowledgement of my words. I stood there, my hand on his shoulder, the warmth of his skin seeping through his shirt. And I realized how much I wanted to help him, to pull him out of the darkness his father had cast over him. But as I looked at him, I couldn't shake the fear that gnawed at me, the fear that I was becoming entangled in a world I didn't belong to, a world that could destroy me just as it had destroyed Nathan. What if I was just another casualty in the Caldwell legacy, another heart broken by the weight of honor? The 20th day arrived with a heaviness I couldn't shake, a sense of foreboding that clung to me like a second skin. The past few days had been a whirlwind of emotions. Nathan's confession about his father echoing in my mind, his pain, a mirror to my own fears. I'd seen a side of him I hadn't expected, a man broken by the weight of his family's expectations, a man who'd sacrificed everything for a legacy that had only left him hollow. And yet, despite the walls he'd built, I felt myself drawn to him, a pull I couldn't resist, a need to help him find the redemption he so desperately craved. That afternoon, the storm I'd sensed brewing finally broke. I was in the hotel's grand lobby, organizing a stack of guest itineraries, when the double doors swung open with a force that made the air hum. Edward Caldwell strode in, his ebony cane tapping a menacing rhythm against the marble floor, his silver hair gleaming under the chandelier's light. But he wasn't alone. Beside him was a woman, her presence as striking as it was unexpected. She was tall and elegant, her golden hair cascading over her shoulders in soft waves, her emerald green dress hugging her frame like it had been made for her. Her face was a study in beauty, high cheekbones, full lips. But her eyes, a deep hazel, were filled with a pain that made my breath catch. Edward stopped in the center of the lobby, his cold gray eyes scanning the room until they landed on Nathan, who had just emerged from the elevator. "Nathan," Edward called, his voice a low growl that carried the weight of authority. Nathan froze, his expression hardening, but I saw the flicker of unease in his eyes, a crack in his carefully constructed armor. The woman stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the marble, and I saw Nathan's face change, pale, then ashen, as if he'd seen a ghost. "Laura," he whispered, his voice barely audible. But the name carried a weight that filled the room with tension. I stood there, my hands gripping the edge of the concierge desk, my heart pounding as I tried to piece together what was happening. Laura's gaze locked onto Nathan, her hazel eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "You promised me," she said, her voice trembling, each word a dagger aimed at his heart. "You promised you'd marry me, Nathan. But you left me. Left us. Because of him." She gestured toward Edward, her hand shaking, her voice breaking on the last word. "You chose your father's honor over our love." The lobby seemed to shrink, the murmurs of guests fading into a distant hum as the weight of her words settled over us. I looked at Nathan, waiting for him to deny it, to say something, anything. But he stood there, his face a mask of anguish, his hands trembling at his sides. Edward's lips curled into a cruel smile, his eyes glinting with triumph. "She's the proof of your failure, Nathan," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You thought you could bury the past, but it always comes back. And now, you'll lose everything." I felt a surge of anger, a protective instinct I couldn't suppress. But before I could speak, Laura turned and walked away, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Edward followed, his cane tapping a final, mocking rhythm as he left Nathan standing there, a broken man in the middle of his own empire. That night, I found Nathan in the hotel's library, a sanctuary of dark wood and leather-bound books, the air thick with the scent of aged paper and wax. A single candelabrum flickered on the table beside him, casting a warm glow over his face. But the light couldn't erase the shadows in his eyes. He sat in a high-backed chair, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his tie discarded, his shirt unbuttoned, at the collar. He looked like a man on the edge, teetering between despair and surrender. I stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me, and his eyes flicked to mine, the storm within them raging with a ferocity that made my chest ache. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice rough, but there was no conviction in his words, only exhaustion. "I had to come," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "What happened today? Who was she, Nathan? What did she mean?" He set the glass down with a heavy thud, his hand trembling as he ran it through his hair. For a long moment he didn't speak, the silence stretching between us like a chasm. Then, finally, he looked at me, his eyes raw with a pain I'd never seen before. "Laura was everything," he said, his voice breaking on the last word. "We were in love, Charlotte. I wanted to marry her, to build a life with her. But my father, he wouldn't allow it. He arranged a marriage with a woman from a powerful family, someone who could strengthen the Caldwell name. He said if I didn't comply, he'd disown me, destroy everything I'd worked for. So I let her go. I broke her heart to save my father's honor." His words hit me like a tidal wave, the depth of his sacrifice washing over me, and I felt tears prick my eyes. I moved closer, sitting on the edge of the table beside him, the candle light flickering between us. "You didn't have to do that," I said softly, my voice thick with emotion. "You didn't have to give up your happiness for him." Nathan's gaze dropped to his hands, his fingers clenching into fists. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "But I've regretted it, every day since." He looked up at me then, and I saw the tears glistening in his eyes, a vulnerability that stripped him bare. "I've been living in a prison of my own making, Charlotte, and I don't know how to escape." I reached out, my hand finding his, and I felt the warmth of his skin, the tremor in his fingers as he let me hold him. Tears spilled down his cheeks, silent and unashamed, and I couldn't hold back my own. I slid off the table, kneeling beside him, and pulled him into my arms, his head resting against my shoulder as he let go of the pain he'd carried for so long. In that moment, I knew I couldn't leave him. Not because of the deal, not because of my job, but because I loved him. I loved the man beneath the scars, the man who'd given up everything for a legacy that had only broken him. And I would fight for him, for us, no matter what came next. The 25th day dawned with a storm, both literal and figurative. The sky outside the Caldwell Plaza, a roiling mass of gray clouds that mirrored the turmoil in my heart. The revelation of Laura, Nathan's lost love, had changed everything. I'd held him in the library as he wept, his tears soaking into my shoulder, and in that moment, I'd realized the depth of my feelings for him. I loved him. Not the cold, controlled CEO the world saw, but the broken man beneath. The one who'd sacrificed his happiness for a legacy that had only brought him pain. But loving him came with a price, one I wasn't sure I was ready to pay. The storm broke that morning, not just in the rain that lashed against the hotel's windows, but in the form of a media firestorm that threatened to consume everything Nathan had built. I was in his office organizing a stack of contracts when the news alert popped up on his computer screen, a headline that made my blood run cold. Caldwell heir abandoned true love for family honor, a tale of betrayal. The article was brutal, detailing Nathan's past with Laura, painting him as a heartless opportunist who'd discarded her to appease his father. It quoted Laura directly, her words a dagger aimed at Nathan's heart. He chose power over love, and I'll never forgive him. The story had gone viral, and the fallout was immediate. Stocks for the Caldwell Corporation plummeted, investors pulled out, and the internet buzzed with speculation about Nathan's downfall. I looked at Nathan, who stood by the window, his silhouette stark against the rain-streaked glass. The dim light from the desk lamp cast shadows across his face, highlighting the exhaustion etched into his features. He slammed his fist against the desk, the sound sharp and jarring, his knuckles whitening as the veins in his hand stood out in sharp relief. "I can't let my father win," he said, his voice a low growl, filled with a determination that bordered on desperation. "He's behind this. I know he is. He wants to destroy me, to prove I'm not worthy of the Caldwell name." I stepped closer, my heart aching at the sight of him, a man on the brink of breaking. "You don't have to fight him alone," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "We can face this together." He turned to me then, his gray eyes softening, the storm within them calming for a moment. "You don't have to stay," he said, his voice low and rough, his hand reaching out to brush against my cheek, the touch so gentle it made my breath catch. "I don't want to drag you into this mess, Charlotte. You've already given me more than I deserve." His words pierced me, a mix of gratitude and guilt that made my chest tighten. I grasped his hand, holding it against my cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin against mine. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, my voice firm, a vow I hadn't realized I was ready to make until that moment. "I'm here for you, Nathan. I'll fight for you." For a moment, he just looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and I saw something flicker in them. Hope, perhaps, or something deeper. Something that mirrored the love I felt for him. But the moment was fleeting, replaced by the weight of the battle ahead. I knew what I had to do. If Edward was behind this, then Laura was the key. She was the one who'd spoken to the press, the one who'd set this fire. I had to find her, to convince her to retract her story, to give Nathan a chance to rebuild what his father was trying to destroy. I tracked her down to a small cafe on the edge of the city, a quaint place with mismatched chairs and the rich aroma of coffee filling the air. The rain had stopped, but the air was still cold, a damp chill that seeped into my bones as I stepped inside. Laura sat at a corner table, her golden hair pulled back in a loose bun, her hazel eyes staring into a cup of coffee as if it held the answers to her pain. She looked up as I approached, her expression hardening, her lips curling into a sneer. "What?" "Do you want?" she asked, her voice cold, her red lips a stark contrast against her pale skin. "Come to plead for him? To beg me to take it all back?" I sat down across from her, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to keep them from trembling. "I'm here because I care about him," I said, my voice steady despite the nerves twisting in my stomach. "I know he hurt you, Laura. I know he made a terrible choice. But he's not the man he was back then. He's trying to be better, to make things right. If you let this story destroy him, you're not just hurting Nathan. You're hurting everyone who depends on him. Everyone who works for him. Everyone who believes in him." Laura's eyes narrowed, her gaze sharp and unyielding. "You think you know him?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You think you're special because he's let you into his world? You're nothing to him, Charlotte. Just another pawn in his game, just like I was. He'll discard you the moment you're no longer useful." Her words cut deep, a knife twisting in my chest, and for a moment I faltered, the fear I'd been suppressing rising to the surface. What if she was right? What if I was just a tool to Nathan, a temporary shield against his father's wrath? But then I thought of the man I'd held in the library, the man who'd let me see his tears, his pain, his heart. I thought of the way he'd looked at me in his office, the gratitude in his eyes, the unspoken promise in his touch. No, I wasn't just a pawn. I was more than that to him, and he was more than that to me. "I'm not here to beg," I said, my voice firm, my resolve hardening. "I'm here to ask you to do the right thing. Not for me, not even for Nathan, but for yourself. Let go of the past, Laura. Don't let it destroy you." She stared at me, her expression unreadable, and for a moment, I thought I'd failed. But then she looked away, her shoulders slumping, and I saw the fight drain out of her. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, and I knew that was the best I could hope for. As I left the cafe, the weight of the day settled over me, a heavy burden I couldn't shake. I'd fought for Nathan, for the man I loved, but at what cost? And would it be enough to save him from the storm his father had unleashed? The 29th day arrived with a weight I could feel in my bones, a heaviness that pressed down on me as I stood in the private suite at the Caldwell Plaza. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a soft glow over the silk rug beneath my feet, its intricate patterns a stark contrast to the chaos in my mind. I'd spent the night replaying my confrontation with Laura, her words echoing like a warning. "You're nothing to him, Charlotte, just another pawn in his game." I'd fought for Nathan, poured my heart into saving him from the media storm his father had unleashed, but doubt gnawed at me, a relentless whisper that I might have risked everything for a man who couldn't love me back. My phone buzzed on the bedside table, shattering the silence, and I picked it up with trembling hands. The message was from Emily's friend, Sarah, and the words on the screen stopped my heart. "Emily's been in an accident. She's at St. Mary's Hospital. Come quickly." Panic surged through me, a tidal wave that drowned out every other thought. Emily, my little sister, my responsibility, the one person I'd sworn to protect, was hurt, and I wasn't there. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking as I grabbed my coat, the world narrowing to a single desperate need. I had to get to her. But as I reached for the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the knob. Nathan. He was on the brink of losing everything. His company, his reputation, his chance at redemption. I'd promised to stand by him, to fight for him. But Emily needed me now. The choice tore at me, a jagged rift between the love I felt for Nathan and the duty I owed my family. I thought of my father, of the promise I'd made at his grave to take care of Emily, and I knew what I had to do. But I couldn't leave Nathan without a word, not after everything we'd been through. I sat at the small desk in the suite, pulling a sheet of paper from the drawer, my hands trembling as I picked up a pen. Tears blurred my vision as I wrote, each word a piece of my heart. Nathan, I have to go. Emily's been in an accident, and I need to be with her. I'm sorry I can't stay, but I'll come back. I promise. I believe in you, and I'll fight for you, for us, as soon as I can. Charlotte. The tears fell freely now, staining the paper, but I folded it carefully, leaving it on the desk where he'd find it. Then I grabbed my bag and ran, the weight of my decision a stone in my chest. The hospital was a blur of white walls and antiseptic smells, the sharp scent of disinfectant stinging my nose as I raced through the corridors. I found Emily in a small room on the 3rd floor, her face pale against the stark white sheets, her arm in a sling, a bandage wrapped around her forehead. She looked so small, so fragile, and my heart broke at the sight of her. Emily, I whispered, rushing to her side, taking her hand in mine. Her fingers were cold, but they squeezed mine weakly, a small smile tugging at her lips. Charlotte, she said, her voice hoarse but filled with relief. I'm okay. Just a concussion and a broken arm. The car, it came out of nowhere. I sat beside her, my tears falling as I held her hand, the guilt crashing over me like a wave. I should have been there, I said, my voice breaking. I should have been with you. Emily shook her head, her grip tightening on my hand. No, Charlotte, she said, her voice soft but firm. You've always been there for me. You've given up so much to take care of me, to keep Dad's promise, but you don't have to sacrifice everything for me. You deserve to live for yourself, too. Her words hit me like a revelation, a truth I'd been too afraid to face. I'd spent so long putting Emily first, carrying the weight of my father's promise, that I'd forgotten how to live for myself. But Nathan, he'd shown me a glimpse of what that could be, a life where I wasn't just surviving, but truly living, loving, fighting for something greater than myself. I thought of the letter I'd left him, of the promise I'd made to return, and I knew I couldn't abandon him. Not now. Not when he needed me most. I stayed with Emily until she fell asleep, her breathing steady, the monitors beeping softly in the background. Then I kissed her forehead, whispering a promise to be back soon, and left the hospital, my heart pounding with a new resolve. I had to get back to Nathan, to stand by him as he faced the final blow his father was preparing to deliver. I returned to the Caldwell Plaza, just as the sun was setting, the sky a blaze of orange and pink that seemed to mock the darkness in my heart. I found Nathan in his office, the room dimly lit, a stack of papers on his desk. He was holding a pen, poised to sign a document that I recognized immediately, the agreement to transfer ownership of the Caldwell Corporation to his father, a last-ditch effort to appease Edward and protect Laura from further scrutiny. My heart stopped, and I ran to him, my breath coming in gasps. Don't do this, I said, my voice trembling, tears streaming down my face as I grabbed his arm, stopping him mid-signature. Don't give up, Nathan. We can fight this together. He looked up at me, his gray eyes wide with shock, then softening with a gratitude that made my chest ache. Charlotte, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. You came back. I promised I would, I said, my voice breaking as I cupped his face in my hands, feeling the warmth of his skin, the stubble rough against my palms. I'm here for you, Nathan. We'll get through this. He pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly, his breath warm against my hair. Thank you, he murmured, his voice a mix of relief and wonder. Thank you for coming back to me. In that moment, I knew I'd made the right choice. I'd sacrificed my fear, my doubt, to be here for Nathan, to fight for the family we were building together. And I would keep fighting, no matter what came next. The 30th day arrived with a quiet that felt almost sacred, a stillness that settled over the Caldwell Plaza, like a long-awaited exhale. The storm that had raged for weeks, both in the media and in our hearts, had finally begun to clear, leaving behind a fragile hope that I clung to with every fiber of my being. I stood by Nathan's side in the hotel's grand lobby, the same place where Edward and Laura had confronted him, where the cracks in his armor had been laid bare. But today was different. Today, Nathan was taking back control, not just of his empire, but of his life. He'd called a press conference, a bold move to address the scandal that had nearly destroyed him. The lobby was transformed into a stage, a long table set up at the front, microphones clustered like a swarm of bees, their wires snaking across the marble floor. Reporters filled the space, their cameras flashing, the air buzzing with anticipation. Nathan stood tall beside me, his black suit impeccably tailored, his jaw set with a determination that made him look every inch the CEO he was. But I saw the vulnerability beneath, the slight tremor in his hand as he adjusted his tie, the way his gray eyes flicked to mine for reassurance. I squeezed his hand, a silent promise that I was here, that I wasn't going anywhere. He stepped up to the microphones, the room falling silent as he began to speak. "I've made mistakes," he said, his voice steady, resonant, carrying the weight of a man who'd faced his demons and come out stronger. "I've let the expectations of others dictate my choices, and in doing so, I've hurt people I cared about, people I loved." His gaze shifted to the side, where Laura stood, her golden hair catching the light, her hazel eyes soft with a mix of pain and hope. "Laura, I'm sorry," he continued, his voice breaking slightly, the rawness of his apology cutting through the room. "I should have fought for us, for the life we could have had. I let my father's demands come between us, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life." The room was silent, the reporters hanging on his every word, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. Nathan turned back to the crowd, his voice gaining strength. "But I'm done living in the past," he said, his tone firm, a declaration of a man reborn. "I'm done letting my father's shadow define me. From this day forward, I'll lead the Caldwell Corporation with integrity, with compassion, and with the courage to do what's right, not just for the company, but for the people who matter most." Laura stepped forward, her expression softening, and I saw the forgiveness in her eyes, a quiet acceptance that brought tears to my own. She nodded, a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes, and I knew she'd decided to let go of the pain, to move forward. Edward, who stood at the back of the room, his ebony cane gripped tightly in his hand, said nothing. But I saw the flicker of something in his cold gray eyes, resignation, perhaps, or a grudging respect. He turned and left, his cane tapping a slow retreat, and I knew that, in his own way, he'd accepted Nathan's defiance. The press conference ended, the reporters dispersing with their stories of redemption and renewal, and I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Nathan turned to me, his eyes searching mine, and I saw the gratitude there, the love that mirrored my own. "Thank you," he said, his voice low, meant only for me. "For everything." I smiled, my heart swelling with a joy I hadn't thought possible. "We did it together," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "You're free now, Nathan." That night, he led me to the balcony where we'd stood on the night of the gala, the night I'd first seen the man beneath the mask. The air was cool. The scent of jasmine carried on the breeze, and the moon hung low in the sky, its silvery light casting a soft glow over us. Nathan turned to me, his gray eyes shimmering with an intensity that made my breath catch, and I saw the man I loved, the man who'd fought for his redemption, who'd chosen love over honor, who'd become my home. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box, and my heart stopped as he knelt before me, the moonlight glinting off the ring inside. A simple band with a single diamond, its sparkle a promise of forever. "Charlotte," he said, his voice trembling with emotion, "I can't give you the world. I've learned that power and wealth mean nothing without love. But I can give you my heart, my life, everything I am. I want to build a future with you, a family, a home where we can be free to love, to heal, to grow. Will you stay with me? Will you be my wife?" Tears streamed down my face, a mix of joy and relief, and I nodded, unable to speak as I sank to my knees beside him, throwing my arms around him. "Yes," I whispered, my voice breaking as I pressed my lips to his, the taste of salt and love mingling between us. We kissed under the moonlight, the world fading away until it was just us, two broken souls who'd found each other, who'd fought for each other, who'd built something beautiful from the ashes of our pasts. As we pulled apart, I looked into his eyes, seeing the future we'd create together. A life filled with love, with laughter, with the family I'd always longed for. I thought of Emily, safe and healing, of the promise I'd kept to my father, and I knew he'd be proud of me, not just for taking care of her, but for finding my own happiness. I thought of the 30 days that had brought me here, a journey that had started with a cold bargain, but had ended with a love I'd never imagined possible. Nathan stood, pulling me to my feet, and we turned to face the horizon. The first light of dawn breaking over the city, a golden glow that promised a new beginning. We stepped into that dawn together, hand in hand, our hearts intertwined, ready to face whatever came next with the strength of our love and the power of forgiveness. If you've been touched by this journey of love, redemption, and the power of forgiveness, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. It means the world to us. And if you want to join more heartfelt stories that inspire and uplift, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an update. Let's keep exploring the beauty of the human spirit together.